"You're just taking up space." That's what he said. Without raising his voice. Without looking me in the eye. As if tossing away an old piece of furniture from the living room. And there, in the middle of the kitchen, with the cup still warm in my hand, I understood I had become invisible. This story doesn't begin with a shout, nor with a scandal. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that fills the house after everyone already has what they need, and no one asks if you're still standing. Taking care of the grandkids, washing the dishes, preparing dinner. Everything seemed normal, until my body began to falter and my courage began to awaken. This video is about a new beginning. About the exact moment when a woman realizes that sacrifice cannot be her entire identity. That being a mother, a grandmother, a partner, all of that is part of who we are, but it cannot swallow us whole. You're about to meet Miriam, an ordinary woman who decided to break free from autopilot and finally say no. And it wasn't just any no, it was a no more heavy with history, weight, and dignity. If you've ever felt like you were living for everyone else and forgetting yourself, this video is for you. There's no magic formula here. But there is courage. There is choice. There is freedom. With every part of this story, you'll realize you are not alone. And yes, there is a way back to yourself. But first, let me ask you something. At what moment did you put yourself aside just to fit into someone else's routine? And if this topic touches you in any way, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Join us on this journey of rediscovery and liberation. She was in the kitchen when she heard it. The phrase dropped like a dry thunderclap on a gray day. "Then you're just taking up space." Coming from her own son, the one she once rocked in her arms, the one whose hand she held tight when he was afraid of the dark. There was no anger in the words, only a cold weariness, almost mechanical. But the impact was devastating. Miriam felt her legs weaken, not from physical pain, but from something worse, the collapse of her dignity. It wasn't just an insult, it was a sentence. For the first time in years, she saw herself. And what she saw was nothing more than a faded shadow of who she once had been. Invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, like fog covering everything little by little. First, you stop choosing the flavor of the juice. Then, no one asks if you want to watch the movie. Over time, even your opinions become background noise. And the worst part? Sometimes you help this disappearance along, thinking you're helping, avoiding conflict, being understanding. Until one day you realize you're still there whole, but no one really sees you anymore. That was the day Miriam understood silence wasn't peace. It was erasure. There's a particular moment, almost sacred, when the body and mind scream together. As if everything inside of you declares enough. And it's not a hysterical enough. It's a steady sigh, an unflinching gaze in the mirror, a cup of coffee sipped slowly as if to say, "This cup is mine, and I am here." The snap of invisibility isn't only pain. It's a summons. A brutal but necessary invitation to awaken. It's the moment when the weary woman begins to transform into the conscious woman. And from that point on, nothing is ever the same. Have you ever had that snap? Sometimes it disguises itself: a backache no one notices, a sleepless night no one respects, a thank you that never comes. Miriam's moment came in the very house where she had raised children, scrubbed floors, cooked meals with love. And it was there, the most familiar place, that she felt like a stranger. Like a guest only called upon when there was something to do. Her son's words hadn't created this feeling. They had only put into words what she had been carrying in silence for far too long. It's curious how the most defining moments in our lives aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes, it's in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, between a cup of tea and a pile of dishes, that the soul finally wakes up. And when it does, nothing that once seemed normal makes sense anymore. That night, Miriam sat at the edge of her bed, quiet. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She simply thought, "I am not just this." And that sentence was her first step toward freedom. Because every transformation begins with a refusal. The refusal to remain invisible. The hardest part wasn't hearing the words. It was admitting that she had been feeling this way for years, but never dared to say it out loud. Because speaking requires more than a voice, it requires autonomy. And someone who has lived so long as the homemaker, the family's caretaker, the one for others, often forgets she can also belong to herself. But that day, Miriam didn't forget. She remembered. She remembered the girl who once wrote hidden poems, the woman who dreamed of traveling to faraway cities, the grandmother who longed to tell stories, not just pack school bags. And in that silent reminder, she rediscovered her identity. There's something powerful about recognizing the exact moment when everything begins to change. Not because the world changed, but because you decided to look with new eyes. Miriam didn't yet know what would come next. But she already knew what she no longer wanted. And that was enough to take the first step. Sometimes life calls for a restart without a set date. A leap into the dark where courage is your only companion. But it's in that dark where you discover something better than external light, your own flame, lit by yourself. And here's an invitation: if you too have ever felt that snap, that sensation that you need to breathe different air, to meet another version of yourself, know that you are not alone. This video is here to remind you that even when everything feels small, your inner voice is enormous. And that every time you say, "I deserve more," a door opens. In the next chapter, we'll talk about a life of unrecognized service, the kind of sacrifice we give from the heart but the world insists on ignoring. Waking up before everyone else. Preparing breakfast. Remembering vaccine dates, school meetings, bills to pay. Organizing the house, washing the clothes, cooking with care, and still smiling when someone praised the meal as if it had been effortless. This was Miriam's routine for years. And there was no manual, no holidays, no bonus at the end of the month. It was work done with her entire body, her entire soul, and she did it without question. But slowly, what once was care became obligation. What once was affection became expectation. And what once was effort turned invisible. The problem with domestic work, when it's done out of love, is that it gets romanticized. And love, contrary to what people say, doesn't pay bills. Miriam gave everything of herself. But no one noticed. Because when the house is clean, the food prepared, and the children in order, it looks like the bare minimum. But behind that minimum, there was renunciation. Invisibility begins when silence becomes routine. And she no longer knew what she liked to eat, because she always made what others wanted. She no longer knew what music she liked, because the television was always stuck on the children's channel. How many times have you caught yourself saying, "I'll just do it"? Sometimes it feels easier to solve than to explain. But that constant making it easier slowly erases us. And before you know it, no one asks if you need help anymore. Miriam became the household gear, functional, predictable, necessary but faceless, nameless, and without rest. There was no paycheck, no vacation. And the worst, there was no recognition. As if her care were automatic. As if her affection were a lifetime contract. But she was tired. Her back ached. Her soul too. There is a subtle cruelty in watching everyone around you rest while you keep standing. Miriam spent nights awake by her grandson's side with a fever, and the next morning no one asked if she had slept. She cared for everything so that others could live well, but survived on cold coffee and aspirin. The sacrifice was daily, but so silent that no one saw it anymore. And that's when she began to realize the problem wasn't what she did, but how everyone believed it was her eternal obligation. Her affection had become service. And service, a prison without bars. It is hard to accept that dedication, when unacknowledged, turns into a burden. Miriam began to notice fatigue in her body, the urge to disappear, the disinterest in things that once brought her joy. The routine that once symbolized care was now a sign of exhaustion. And no one noticed. Because those who get used to being served rarely see the one who serves. But she felt it. She felt the weight on her shoulders, the silence in her words, the absence of a simple thank you. And she realized she was living a paradox. She loved everyone deeply, but had lost herself in the process. There's a question worth asking: how long can love justify self-erasure? To love is not to disappear. To love is also to say not today, to set boundaries, to demand respect. Miriam began to question each gesture she made automatically. Did she really want it? Or was she stuck in repetition mode? She began paying attention to herself, a revolutionary act for someone who had spent decades caring only for others. And in this small awakening, something new began to emerge: the idea that she could have autonomy. That her freedom didn't need to be a sin. She didn't want anyone to feel guilty. She just wanted them to notice. To really see her. To understand that her service wasn't automatic, it was a choice. And choices, when ignored, become impositions. Miriam didn't want to scream, didn't want to slam doors. She wanted to be heard. And it began when she herself decided to listen to her own pain. To listen to her fatigue. To listen to what her body had been trying to say for years. Because dignity lives in those details, in small but firm choices. And it was time to start choosing for herself. In the next chapter, we'll dive into personal erasure. When a woman stops being a person and becomes a function. And how this silent and cruel process steals the identity of so many who, like Miriam, were once the protagonists of their own stories. First, it was the mirror. Miriam realized she no longer looked at herself. Not because she avoided her reflection, but because she simply forgot it was there. The mirror became a functional object, like the stove, the clothesline, the broom. It was only for checking if there was something in her teeth, if her hair looked acceptable. But to truly see herself? That wasn't part of her routine anymore. Erasure doesn't arrive suddenly. It begins as distraction, then becomes absence. And before you know it, only the shadow remains of the woman you once were. The second sign was clothing. Her clothes began losing shape, losing identity. They were always the most practical, the loosest, the most neutral. Not by choice but by fatigue. Dressing in something pretty seemed frivolous. Lipstick? For what? If no one notices? If no one even asks if you slept well, why would they notice a new pair of earrings? Without realizing it, Miriam faded into her own choices. Choices based on what was convenient, not on what made her happy. And with time, what once was comfort became absence of self. This erasure has a trap: it disguises itself as practicality. You think you're just being realistic, practical, mature. But in truth, you're slowly removing yourself from the equation of your own life. Miriam saw herself as the household's gear, necessary, but replaceable. There was no paycheck, but there was a job. And worse, there was no rest. Because when you are just the mother, just the grandmother, just the caretaker, who are you when those roles fade away? She didn't know anymore. And that scared her. During a casual conversation, she realized she always spoke of herself in the past tense. I used to love writing, I used to love traveling, I used to be a dreamer. All in the past. As if the real Miriam had been locked in some emotional trunk, leaving only an extension of everyone else's needs. But she was still alive. She felt it in her body, despite the fatigue. The silence wasn't total. There was still a whisper inside her, a persistent call: you can still find yourself again. This process is cruel because it happens without witnesses. The world celebrates the mother who does everything, the grandmother who always says yes, the woman who never complains. But no one sees the pain of not being called by name, of not hearing a "how are you?" That isn't tied to a list of chores. Miriam realized it had been a long time since anyone had known her preferences. Whether she preferred cold or heat, sweet or savory, old movies or documentaries. And that hurt. Because preferences are part of identity. And she felt hers slipping away. There's a painful but necessary question: if we take away all the roles you perform, mother, grandmother, wife, homemaker, what remains? Miriam faced that question with fear, but also with hope. Because even in erasure, there was still a spark. There was still desire. She began writing in an old notebook, like she had in her youth. Simple things, memories, loose phrases, forgotten dreams. And there, between crooked lines and fading ink, she rediscovered her voice. A voice that had been asleep, not dead. Personal erasure isn't just an emotional issue, it's a matter of dignity. And dignity begins the moment you decide to see yourself again. Miriam started drinking coffee slowly, choosing her favorite cup, listening to music that only she liked. Small actions that might have seemed insignificant, but that returned color to her days. It was an exercise in daily autonomy, one gesture at a time. And with each gesture, she reaffirmed, I exist. Even if no one saw it yet. Even if no one understood. She knew it. And that was already a new beginning. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the moment when silence becomes unbearable. That point when you begin to hear what others say behind your back and realize that disrespect isn't just in actions, but in the words whispered when they think you're not listening. And that's when something inside you breaks. Or is reborn. There are words that hurt more when they're not said to your face. Miriam learned this while she was picking up toys in the living room and heard, drifting in from the kitchen, a venomous whisper, she's basically part of the furniture now. It was Emily who said it. The daughter-in-law. The same one Miriam helped every day, gently, carefully, trying not to overstep. That wasn't just a critique, it was dehumanization. A cruel label that draped another layer of invisibility over her. To be compared to a piece of furniture. An object. Something you use, lean on, but that has no presence. It was more than unfair. It was brutal. Days later, another line, this time from Daniel, burned like acid, she's just taking up oxygen around here. It was a brief conversation. He didn't know Miriam was behind the bedroom door, folding sheets. It froze her in place. Her son. The one she raised through sleepless nights, the one she defended even when he was wrong, now spoke of her like she was a nuisance. There was no room for doubt anymore. The silence she offered out of love was being read as weakness. Her care had become obligation. And her presence, a burden. It isn't easy to accept that the people you love most are the ones who most devalue you. That the small gestures of affection, once turned routine, have become invisible. Miriam realized she was no longer seen as someone with feelings, aches, desires. She was a useful presence, nothing more. And the cruelest part was that it all came wrapped in silence, not the respectful kind, but the kind born of indifference. A silence that deafens. That wounds. That screams on the inside. And she didn't want to be quiet anymore. This is where many women get lost, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Oh, he's just tired. She didn't mean it that way. It was just a poorly chosen phrase. But for how long? Miriam was done defending the indefensible. Done inventing excuses for the lack of care. She began to understand that respect is non-negotiable. And that every time she swallowed those words in silence, she betrayed herself too. Because silence, when it swallows offenses, becomes complicity with disrespect. And she no longer wanted to be complicit in her own pain. The breaking point wasn't an explosion. It was a clean cut, like removing a rope that had already chafed her neck raw. Miriam didn't shout, didn't confront immediately. But that was when the seed of enough was planted. She stopped answering every call the second it came. Stopped anticipating other people's needs. She began to observe. To collect those sentences as signs. Signs that it was time to change. Because if the world around her no longer saw her, then she would have to relearn how to see herself and how to demand respect. For a long time, silence had been the space where Miriam sought peace. Now it had become the territory of contempt. She realized the cruelest noise wasn't the shout, it was the sneer. And she decided she wouldn't accept that sound in her life anymore. She started writing notes to herself and leaving them around the house. You matter. Your presence has value. Don't accept less. It might seem childish, but those small gestures gave her back her voice. An inner voice first. Then, the voice of boundaries. Being called part of the furniture hurt, yes. But it also set her free. Because in that moment, she finally saw the truth she had long suspected. If she stayed there, quiet, she would be diminished more and more. And she had no time left for that kind of submission. She had a life to live. She deserved to be treated as someone alive. With feelings. With a history. With courage. It was time to stop being scenery and become the protagonist again. Even if the stage was small. Even if the audience didn't applaud. The decision was made. In the next chapter, we dive into Miriam's bravest choice to leave. Not as an escape, but as a profound act of freedom. The understanding that sometimes starting over is the only dignified path. The decision didn't strike like lightning. It wasn't made on the day of the insult. Not in the week of silence. It came like a slow, steady tide, pushing Miriam to the edge of herself until there was nothing left to do but swim in a different direction. Leaving isn't cowardice. It's pure courage, the courage to choose freedom when everything around you seems built to keep you caged. She spent entire nights thinking. She didn't want a fight. She didn't want drama. She just wanted to breathe. To be seen. To have the right to exist outside the role everyone had assigned her. That's when the plan began. Quiet, strategic, almost invisible the way she had learned to be. But now she used that invisibility to her advantage. She made a list of everything she needed: documents, clothes, Evelyn's number she hadn't dialed in ages. She started setting aside change from the market, separating a few clothes she didn't wear often but that would serve her in a new phase. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle in reverse. Instead of building a picture, she took apart the prison. Piece by piece. Miriam told no one. Asked no permission. Gave no signs. She knew that if she said anything, guilt trips, emotional blackmail, and promises of change would come. She knew that cycle by heart. The problem was that the promises never came with actions. And she no longer wanted to live on hope. She wanted to live on reality. One where she had choices. Where she could, for the first time in years, be her own priority. It wasn't easy. But when the soul decides to go, the body finds a way to follow. Understand this: she wasn't running away. She was choosing. Choosing dignity. Choosing freedom. Choosing a new beginning. And yes, that choice hurt. It hurt the way muscles hurt when they start moving again after years of being still. But it was a living pain. The pain of movement. Better than the emotional anesthesia she'd been surviving on. Deep down, Miriam knew it was now or never. She could no longer ignore the call from within. That silent scream saying, "Go." The following Sunday, she made breakfast like always. Left the clothes folded, the sink clean, the fridge stocked. Not out of obligation, but as a final gesture of care. A silent farewell. She grabbed her bag, closed the door gently, and didn't look back. The walk to the bus station was the longest of her life. Not because of time. Because of the symbolism. Each step was an affirmation of autonomy. Each block, a shout of freedom. Evelyn opened the door with wide eyes. She didn't ask why. She asked, "Are you okay?" And right then, Miriam knew she'd made the right choice. Because true shelter doesn't judge, doesn't pressure, doesn't bargain. Shelter recognizes. And that first night on her friend's couch, she slept like she hadn't slept in years whole. Without fear of waking in the middle of the night to turn off a forgotten light or fix bottles. For the first time, silence was rest, not loneliness. Leaving was the first practical act of self-love Miriam had made in decades. A gesture that startled everyone except her. When you've spent a lifetime saying yes to keep the peace, saying no becomes a revolution. And that revolution began without fanfare, but with steadiness. Miriam didn't know exactly what she would do next. But she was certain of what she would never do again: abandon herself. In the next chapter, we'll follow this crucial moment of transition, the reunion with friendship and welcome. Because no one walks alone once she begins to stand up. And sometimes all we need is someone to say, "I see you." Evelyn was the kind of friend life tries to scatter with time but never truly erases. They'd met when they were young, shared confidences, letters, and coffee breaks far too long for people who had 1,000 things to do. With time, routines, children, chores, and life itself sent each to different corners. But one phone call, one single sentence, "I need you," was enough for Evelyn to reply, "Come." And just like that, with no questions and no drama, Miriam found not only her friend but also a part of herself. Evelyn's welcome wasn't made of speeches. It was made of space. Of comfortable silence. Of food prepared without obligation, of a couch with a clean throw blanket, of a cup of tea placed in her hands with a smile that said, "You don't need to explain anything right now." And that was a bomb. Because Miriam didn't need solutions. She needed to be seen. To be received without having to prove anything. That first week, she slept a lot. More than she had in months. The body only rests when it knows it's safe. Real friendship is the kind that remembers who you were before everything went off the rails. Evelyn did this gently. She brought out old photos, told stories Miriam had forgotten, made silly jokes about ex-boyfriends' names. And Miriam laughed. She truly laughed. She discovered she could still laugh. That she still had humor. That her identity hadn't died, it had just been buried under tons of responsibility. With every conversation, every rescued memory, she began to recognize herself again. One piece at a time. It was Evelyn who reminded Miriam that she loved to write. That she had once dreamed of starting a blog of short chronicles. That she had a hidden notebook full of lines no one had ever read. Miriam flushed with embarrassment when she remembered, as if it were a forbidden idea. But in that environment of welcome, everything seemed possible. Evelyn didn't push. She pointed. "What if you started writing again? Just for you?" And so the spark began to catch. One word. Then another. Until, without noticing, Miriam wrote her first chronicle in years. On paper, she wrote about silence. About how sometimes we don't disappear, we are erased. But also about how it's possible to relight your own flame. Evelyn read and cried. She said, "That is you, Miriam." And Miriam believed her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the author of her own story. Because friendship is also a mirror that reflects what the world tried to distort. Evelyn handed back to Miriam the courage to look at herself with kindness. To recognize herself with dignity. In that environment of affection, Miriam began to understand what freedom really was. It wasn't doing whatever you wanted all the time, it was the ability to choose. To say yes with desire and no without guilt. Evelyn respected her silences, her pauses, her pace. And that healed her. When you spend years being invaded by other people's demands, finding someone who respects your limits is an act of love. Miriam learned that true shelter doesn't smother. It sets you free. Deep down, that was all she wanted, a place where she could simply be Miriam. No function. No title. No charge. And Evelyn offered it without fuss, without heroics, without expecting anything in return. That's how friendship became a bridge. A bridge between the Miriam who had been erased and the Miriam who was beginning to appear. More whole. More aware. More self-possessed. Because when someone truly welcomes you, you start to believe you deserve that care even from yourself. In the next chapter, we'll follow the small gestures that represent great victories: cooking for yourself, choosing a book, reorganizing a space. The rediscovery of autonomy begins in the details. And it's in those details that freedom starts to bloom. The first thing Miriam did was cook just for herself. Not a meal for everyone. Not something practical, merely to keep going. It was simple, but intentional: fresh rice, sautéed vegetables, a poached egg she had always thought looked beautiful in movies but had never tried to make. And when she sat down at the table alone, with a plate put together with care, she felt something different. A quiet, subtle pleasure. This wasn't about food. It was about treating herself with tenderness. About saying, through gestures, you deserve something made just for you. The first thing Miriam did was cook just for herself. Not a meal for everyone. Not something practical, merely to keep going. It was simple, but intentional: fresh rice, sautéed vegetables, a poached egg she had always thought looked beautiful in movies but had never tried to make. And when she sat down at the table alone, with a plate put together with care, she felt something different. A quiet, subtle pleasure. This wasn't about food. It was about treating herself with tenderness. About saying, through gestures, you deserve something made just for you. Then came the books. Miriam went to Evelyn's shelf and picked one without asking for permission, almost timidly. It wasn't about finishing it, it was about remembering that her mind could wander outside grocery lists and school schedules. As she flipped through the pages, she rediscovered that her thoughts could still be curious, hungry, alive. That she could still enter new worlds without leaving the armchair. Every chapter was a reminder, I am still here. I still think. I still dream. She also reorganized a small corner in Evelyn's house, not out of obligation, but as an act of belonging. She placed flowers in a vase, adjusted a photo frame, chose a pillow for the chair where she liked to sit. And that small gesture brought back something huge, the feeling that she could still shape her surroundings. That she wasn't condemned to merely adapt to spaces created by others, but that she had the right to leave her mark. Autonomy begins in details like this. Miriam began writing daily. Sometimes 2 lines, sometimes entire pages. She wrote about the exhaustion of invisibility, about the pain of silence, but also about the wonder of rediscovery. Evelyn encouraged her, but never pressured her. The act of writing became therapy. Each word was like a thread pulling her back from the fog. Each page a mirror reminding her she hadn't disappeared, she had only been waiting to be called back. And the one calling her back was herself. One afternoon, Miriam looked in the mirror and, for the first time in years, didn't just check her hair. She looked at herself. Truly looked. The wrinkles no longer seemed like signs of fatigue, but like traces of stories. Her eyes, a little tired, still carried light. She put on a blouse she liked, brushed her hair with patience, and even dabbed on a bit of lipstick. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for her. And that simple act carried the force of a revolution, to remember that she was still a woman, not just a role. That night, she told Evelyn, I feel like I've come back to life. And Evelyn, with a smile, replied, no, you never left. You were just hidden. Now you've chosen to appear again. Those words sealed the process Miriam had been building step by step. She realized that freedom isn't a distant place, it's in daily decisions. In the courage to say no, in the tenderness of saying yes to herself, in the firmness of setting limits, and in the sweetness of choosing what brings her joy. Miriam's story isn't about escape. It's about rebirth. About remembering that sacrifice doesn't define identity. That being a mother, grandmother, or partner are important chapters, but never the whole book. That autonomy isn't selfishness, it's dignity. And that silence, when chosen, can be peace, but when imposed, it is erasure. This video is a call for every woman who has ever felt invisible, who has ever heard that she was just taking up space. Miriam shows that it's possible to rise, to reclaim yourself, to relight your own flame. It's not easy. It's not immediate. But it's real. And it begins with something as small as cooking for yourself, writing in a notebook, or daring to look in the mirror with kindness. And I ask you, from the heart, how many times have you erased yourself just to keep others comfortable? How long has it been since you did something just for you? If this story resonated with you, let it be a reminder you are not alone. There is a path back to yourself. A path made of choices, courage, and small acts of self-love. And every time you say, I deserve more, you take another step on that path. So stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because together, we can turn silence into voice, invisibility into presence, and pain into freedom. He decided to visit the neighborhood library. It was an old place, filled with the smell of yellowed pages, a place almost no one visited anymore. She walked between the shelves as if she were meeting an old love again. She picked up a book by Clarice Lispector, another by Martha Medeiros, and a third on philosophy she wasn't even sure she would understand. She sat in a corner and spent hours there. No schedule. No child calling her. No pot on the stove. It was just her and those stories. And for the first time in a long while, time seemed like a friend. Autonomy is this being able to decide where to be, when to go, who to be with, and even how to spend your own minutes. Miriam realized she no longer knew how to choose for pleasure. She always chose what was useful, functional, expected. But now, choices were hers again. She decided to reorganize the room Evelyn had given her. She moved some things around, hung a colorful blanket, placed a small vase on the window. Small changes, but ones that turned the space into a refuge. A corner that said, "Here lives someone who sees herself." One day, she went to the market just to buy flowers. She didn't need them. They weren't food, or an essential item. But they were beauty, color, life. And that was enough. She brought the flowers home, trimmed the stems, chose the vase. As she arranged the branches, she remembered her grandmother, who used to say every woman should have flowers in her house even if it was just one. That day, Miriam finally understood what that meant. It was about remembering her own dignity, her own worth. About telling herself you deserve what is beautiful, even without a special occasion. She began to walk through the neighborhood without a destination. Watching people, the sky, the dogs on the sidewalks. Walking without purpose was, in a way, walking toward herself. With every step, Miriam felt something inside her was being rearranged. It wasn't a spectacular change. It was subtle. Like trading shallow, rushed breathing for a deep, steady one. Like returning to inhabit her own body after years of living on autopilot. It was her once again, in motion. Only now, with awareness. Autonomy also came with difficult decisions. Saying no to some invitations. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-care. Evelyn invited her to an event full of people, but Miriam still didn't feel ready. And for the first time, she said no without over-explaining. Just not today. And she was respected. And she felt strong because of it. Because saying no when you are used to saying yes all the time is a revolutionary act. It's about setting boundaries. It's about protecting your own inner space. A new habit was born there, writing in the morning, before anything else. Miriam would wake up, make her tea, and write 3 pages in her notebook. Anything. Without censorship. It was like wiping clean the mirror of the soul. Sometimes she wrote sadness, sometimes anger, other times dreams. And little by little, those pages became a map. A way to understand who she was now. Who she wanted to be. And who she would never again allow anyone to erase. Writing was not a luxury. It was a necessity. A daily exercise of identity. In the next chapter, we witness a delicate and powerful moment, the reunion between Miriam and her grandson Oliver. A bond that went beyond blood, built on genuine affection, without intermediaries, without function. Just love. He arrived holding Daniel's hand, his eyes curious and his heart light. Oliver was only 7 years old, but he already carried that rare sensitivity of someone who feels more than he speaks. The moment he saw Miriam, he ran. He didn't ask why she had left. He didn't demand explanations. He simply hugged her with all the strength of an affection free of judgment. And in that embrace, Miriam felt something break inside her, but not from pain. It was as if a part of her, the one that still doubted her own worth, had finally found shelter. The reunion didn't happen at some carefully planned moment or in a symbolic place. It was in the neighborhood square, on a shy, sunny afternoon. Evelyn had suggested they meet there, in a neutral space, lighter, without the weight of old expectations. Miriam brought a picnic blanket, some sliced fruit, and fresh juice. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to start again. Because when love is genuine, it doesn't demand grand gestures. It only requires presence, eye contact, and a ground where both can be themselves, without obligation. During the picnic, Oliver wouldn't stop talking. He told stories about school, about his little friends, about a new cell phone game. Miriam listened as if savoring a rare sweet. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct him. She just listened. And slowly, She realized that their bond had never been broken, only paused. The connection between them was stronger than any absence. It was built on memories, on the smell of food, on bedtime stories invented on the spot. And now, also on the comfort of silence. He asked why she had gone away. Miriam thought carefully before answering. "Because my back hurt, and so did my heart," she said softly. Oliver frowned, thought for a moment, and replied, "When I'm sad, Grandma makes tea for me." "You could make tea for yourself too." Miriam smiled with tearful eyes. In the simplicity of a child, there was wisdom. She truly was making tea for herself now in every sense of the word. And she was finally ready to offer affection again, but this time with healthy boundaries. The afternoon drifted away with improvised board games, drawings on paper with colored pencils, and bursts of laughter. Miriam realized how possible it was to give without losing herself, to care without erasing herself, to love without disappearing. She didn't need to go back to the role of babysitter. She could be a grandmother, a friend, a safe harbor without carrying the world on her shoulders. And that set her free even more. Because the fear of losing her bond with Oliver had been one of the last chains holding her to her old life. At the end of the meeting, she handed him a small notebook. "This is our storybook. Every time we meet, we'll write a new one." Oliver lit up with excitement. He wrote the first entry, "Today Grandma and I became friends again." And that sentence echoed in Miriam's mind for days. Because there lay the essence of it all: friendship, respect, reunion. The kind of love that doesn't demand, doesn't cage, doesn't suffocate. A love with space to breathe. In the days that followed, her meetings with Oliver became regular, but without pressure. He came with Daniel, sometimes with Emily. Miriam kept her rituals, her boundaries, her space. She no longer involved herself in decisions that weren't hers. She no longer allowed herself to be summoned as the solution to everything. She was there by choice. And that choice, reaffirmed with every visit, strengthened their bond. Love had turned into freedom. And for a woman who had spent so much of her life a prisoner of the idea that to love is to sacrifice, that was nothing short of a revolution. Now, Miriam was finally ready to face the next step: the reunion with her children, no longer as an emotional dependent, but as a whole person. In the next chapter, we will see that confrontation. Because for respect to flourish, boundaries must be spoken clearly and without turning back. They arrived as if nothing had ever happened. Daniel with a tense expression, Emily trying to mask her anxiety. They knocked on Evelyn's door on a Saturday afternoon, saying they wanted to talk. Miriam took a deep breath before opening it. Her heart was racing, her hands steady. It was an inevitable moment. There was no room left for half-words. The visit wasn't just a reunion, it was a test. A test of limits, of respect, of autonomy. And Miriam knew this time, she would not yield. She would not go back to the cycle of silence and sacrifice. Daniel began to speak as if he were negotiating a contract. "We understand that you were tired. But you also need to understand that your family needs you." Miriam listened. Silent. Emily added, saying Oliver missed her, that the house felt empty without her presence. And Miriam felt it in the tone, in the words, in the subtle attempt to push her back into her old place. The place of the one who gives care without being cared for. But now, she was no longer willing to occupy that space. Not at that cost. With a calm but firm voice, Miriam answered, "I didn't run away. I chose myself." And for the first time, Daniel was left speechless. She explained that love does not justify erasure. That being present doesn't mean annihilating oneself. And that she wasn't denying her love for her grandchildren, especially not for Oliver. But what she had lived inside that house went far beyond exhaustion. It had been disrespect. It had been invisibility. And she had no intention of returning to a routine where her dignity was negotiable. Emily looked down. She knew Miriam was right. There were attempts at emotional appeal. Daniel said it had been difficult for them to handle everything. That they missed her. that things could be different. But Miriam wasn't there for promises. She was there to say enough, loud and clear. And she did, with the courage of someone who knows true love does not demand unconditional sacrifice. Real love respects. It listens. It cares. And she was no longer at an age nor had the disposition to repeat the same story, hoping for a different ending. She proposed another way of relating to them with defined times, with space for dialogue, with respect for her boundaries. She said she could see Oliver, yes, but when she chose to. That she wasn't retiring from being a grandmother, she was simply reclaiming her freedom. And that didn't mean absence. It meant a new beginning. A beginning with dignity. Emily, though uncomfortable, began to understand. She saw, standing before her, a woman who no longer accepted being reduced to a function. Daniel still tried to control the narrative. Tried to show she was exaggerating, that things weren't that bad. But Miriam didn't retreat. For the first time, she stood between herself and the guilt that had always haunted her. She didn't scream. She didn't defend herself with fury. She simply sustained her choice with the strength of someone who knows what she has lived. And with the serenity of someone who isn't asking for permission, but communicating a decision. A firm woman can frighten. But she also teaches. And that day she taught. The conversation was long, filled with uncomfortable pauses. But necessary. Because confronting isn't fighting, it's positioning yourself. And Miriam did so with clarity. She left the door open for a new kind of relationship, but not for a return to the past. Seeing her children again was painful, yes, but also liberating. Because there is no real freedom without confrontation. Without declaring, in full voice, I've changed. And you will have to learn to live with that. In the next chapter, we will see how this new freedom settles into everyday life. Small habits that once seemed ordinary now gained deep meaning: tea, plants, yoga, stories written in silence. Routine as a symbol of autonomy and not of prison. Freedom, at first, can feel strange. Miriam often caught herself wondering if she truly could do whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. It was like learning to walk again, only now with her own steps. The first habit she created was simple: drinking tea every afternoon, slowly, as a ritual. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about the moment. Choosing the cup, the flavor, the spot in the house with the best light. Sitting without hurry. It was a small gesture, but a powerful one. Like telling the world, I have time for myself. Then came the plants. She started with a succulent Evelyn gave her, then a fern, then a snake plant. Slowly, the balcony filled with color, with life. Taking care of the plants became a metaphor for taking care of herself. Watering, trimming, watching the slow, beautiful growth. Miriam talked to them, gave them names, laughed at her own jokes. It was a kind of quiet freedom where no one expected anything, and still, she gave the best of herself. For herself. For the first time, it wasn't duty. It was joy. She signed up for a community yoga class. At first, she felt out of place. Her body stiff, her mind racing. But the teacher would say this is a space without comparison. And that touched her deeply. Because for so long Miriam had compared herself, judged herself, measured herself against others' standards. There, lying on a mat with her eyes closed, she learned to breathe with intention, to listen to her own rhythm, to accept her limits, and to celebrate each small victory of body, soul, and time. Writing again became part of her routine, not to publish, not to prove anything, just for herself. She began organizing stories of daily life, scattered phrases, forgotten memories. She discovered there was poetry even in the way she prepared rice. That there was dignity in the small observations of life. Evelyn suggested she join a neighborhood writing group, and Miriam, hesitant, accepted. At the first reading, her hands trembled. But when she finished, she heard applause. And once again, she was seen not as grandmother, mother, caretaker, but as an author. Volunteering was another unexpected step. An elderly neighbor needed help with literacy classes for older women. Miriam offered to help. Not as a teacher, but as a presence. As someone who knows the value of being heard. And each meeting was an exchange. She taught letters. The other women taught stories. Stories of sacrifice, invisibility, new beginnings. It was as if, together, they were rewriting their own narratives. And Miriam felt freedom is also sharing. Her days now were simple, yet full of meaning. She woke early, but without rush. Made coffee the way she liked. Read on the balcony. Wrote. Cared for her plants. Walked to the library. Said no when she needed to. Said yes with joy. Sometimes she called Oliver, and now, he also called her, not out of obligation, but out of desire. Their conversations were light, full of affection. Their connection no longer depended on the exhausting routine of the past. It was pure love. Love that is chosen, not demanded. Miriam had learned that freedom is not doing whatever you want, but living without fear of being who you are. That autonomy is not loneliness, it is conscious presence. That silence can be rest, and routine poetry. She no longer needed permission to exist. And most importantly, she no longer asked for it. The woman who was once called part of the furniture was now both root and flower, body and soul, beginning and continuity. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But everyone who crossed her path could see the difference. She now radiated something that cannot be faked: peace. In the next chapter, we reach the turning point: the letter from Daniel. It arrived in a plain envelope, written in his hand. It wasn't long, but it was honest. He said he had thought a lot about their last conversation. He didn't know how to fix things, but he wanted to begin with respect. If you want to talk, I'm here. Miriam read it slowly. It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening. She waited 3 days to respond, not out of anger, but because she wanted to answer with clarity. She wrote that she was well, rebuilding her life in her own way. She thanked him, but said the terms contact would only continue if it was light, sincere, and respectful. I will not go back to who I was, but I remain your mother. Daniel later invited her to lunch at a restaurant. She accepted. He even brought flowers, a small gesture, yet meaningful. The talk was cautious, but for the first time, he truly listened. Emily soon reached out too, her voice softer, admitting her mistakes. She asked for forgiveness, and Miriam gave it not as erasure, but as a path forward. From then on, a new balance formed. She no longer carried her children's burdens. She was present, but on her own terms. Oliver visited often, and their bond grew lighter, freer, based on choice, not demand. Still, guilt sometimes knocked at her door. But Miriam had learned to question it: is this love, or control? Is this care, or self-erasure? Each time she chose herself, the guilt faded, and respect deepened. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real and finally fair. Then came her final act, writing her manifesto. She sat by the window, notebook in hand. She didn't write to complain, but to affirm. To affirm she had lived, loved, suffered, and awakened. Her words were clear: you are not alone. You still have a choice. Freedom is not selfishness, it is survival. She didn't romanticize the pain. She admitted the lonely nights and heavy mornings. But she also wrote: once you awaken, there is no going back to sleep. That truth was her legacy. Her letter was not only hers. It belonged to many women who had given too much and received too little, who had stayed silent to keep peace. It was a call to start again. She signed it with love and courage, Miriam. And now, the story is also yours. How many times have you kept quiet to avoid conflict? How many times have you thought it was too late to begin again? Miriam proved otherwise. It's never too late. Freedom has no age. Dignity begins the moment you choose yourself. So I ask, what will you do with your story? Will you keep shrinking for a love that takes more than it gives? Or will you choose yourself, as Miriam did, even afraid, even tired? If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories that remind you to take the lead in your own life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each story here is a whisper of freedom, and the next one might be yours.